Good morning. You are with the Pension Benefit Design and Funding Task Force. It is December 1st. Welcome back. It's been a few weeks since we met. Part of that delay was intentional because we thought we wouldn't receive the full actuaries reports until mid-November. It turns out that the last batch of them arrived yesterday. And so Chris Roop from Joint Fiscal looks like he got some sleep last night. So it must be he didn't have to burn the midnight oil in order to create a slide deck to help us unpack what the actuaries brought back for information. So thank you, Chris, for making quick work of that. First up on our agenda is to review last meeting. And I don't know if you all can remember what we did in our last meeting, but if anyone has any thoughts or observations or reflections on the last meeting, we'll take a moment to do that now.
I can't remember when it was.
Exactly.
About November 15th.
I believe you were in a little Zoom box. Yeah.
You and I were zooming, I remember.
It was the
Yeah, it was so good.
The
wasn't it?
Oh, no,
10.
some people can't.
It was the 10th, yeah.
Yes, Andrew.
I was just glad that we had Graham Campbell come back to speak to us, talking about revenue. In general, I find Graham's presentation is very clear and to the point and easy to understand. So it's good information to, again, kind of look at some of those factors we've been talking about for revenue, and to get some more clarity, especially on the cannabis, and to get some of the information from the Cannabis Control Board. I think that was really helpful to consider. There are a lot of numbers to look at there and ones that have still been running through my mind.
Anybody else?
Molly.
I'm just remembering that I think we talked a little bit about the hearings, and we talked about the different ideas that people had presented. Janet, I think you summarized something, and I really appreciated that discussion, just kind of going through individual suggestions people had made. That's what it was. The suggestions that people at the hearings had made. Am I not talking? Thank you. I noticed that on the
I think
Zoom
you
end,
want to be,
yeah.
you know, within a few inches.
Yeah, thank you. I noticed that on the Zoom end, so I appreciate the reminder. Yeah, I just remember really appreciating the suggestions people had made in the discussions that we had around that.
Yes, I forgot that we did that.
Me too, until that moment.
Yeah.
Anyone else have any observations from November 10th? All right. Yes. Eric.
I'm pulling from my memory here because it has been a long time, but after what Andrew had mentioned kind of brought something back for me. And I know we've wrestled with how we address the revenue piece, whether we include do it through some sort of appendix. And I was wondering if we could revisit that topic at some point. And if I think the more specific we can be, the better for our long-term work. And if there are certain elements that there is consensus around, I think it would behoove us to explore those and put our report in the best place to be received by the legislature when you all begin your next session's work in earnest. So thank you.
Next up on the agenda is to talk about the timeline of our remaining meetings. We have a goal to wrap up our work by December 15th, which means that we have one meeting between now and then to begin to work on the final recommendations and the final chapters of our report.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
I'm sorry. Are we going to get that last part for the group F
and corrections and all of that first?
The combined one? It's listed online and it's ready for pickup in the copy room.
I think the owner's referring to request number 5.
Yeah, so I think what the holdup on that was that we need to be aware that we have a budget for actuarial services. And so when we finish our day today, we should know, or we should be able to have a better sense of whether we are comfortably within our actuary budget and therefore would have the ability to request that analysis. Or if we have blown through that budget, we may need to reconsider or make other arrangements for having that conversation at a future date. We can't spend more than the $150,000 that we have in our budget for. Well, we're going to be working about the day to day to figure out whether we need to refine any of the scenarios that we asked for back in October. I always expected that we would, right? I didn't think that we would be hitting a home run on our first swing at it, that we may need to go back and look at different combinations of scenarios. But many of those possible actuarial asks are simply, tweak this and run it again, as opposed to building a whole new actuarial analysis. And so the things that we might ask for this afternoon could be easier and less expensive.
So do you know how much we spent so far?
Chris probably has that information.
Sure. Good morning, Chris, Joint Fiscal. So as Representative Copeland-Hans just mentioned, we are planning with an actuarial budget of about $150,000 for the work. We have been invoiced for around 30 to date for the first 3 requests. We have not been invoiced for this request 4 yet, but the cost estimate we received when we submitted it from the actuaries was it would cost between $50,000 to $60,000. So the work we've done to date, I'm working on the assumption that we've obligated 100,000 of the 150,000. So that means we have 50,000 remaining. Whenever we asked them, what we did with request 5 was we asked them to give us a time and cost estimate to see what would it cost to do that analysis. They estimated about $25,000 to do that analysis. And being able to do that was sort of predicated on getting request 4 done first, because one of the things we're asking them to look at in request 5 is applying one of the changes they modeled in request 4 to that universe of employees. So right now, and this is, again, we have not gotten an invoice yet for request 4, but if we're assuming we have 50,000 remaining, 25,000 of that 50 would be for request 5. That would leave 25,000 remaining for follow-up actuarial work. So I think depending on the complexity of what you want to continue studying after this today, we can then submit another request to the actuaries and see, hey, what can we do within our remaining resources? So if we're making some tweaks to the model they've already built for us, it's probably not going to cost all $50,000, but without knowing the complexity of what all you want to look at in the follow-up, it's hard for us to know how much room we have left in our budget. So that's sort of where we are right now on that. I think once we have today's discussion done and we have a sense of what else people want to look at, we can send that over to them and see how much that's going to cost, and then figure out how much room we have to navigate.
Yeah, Molly.
I just want to ask a question about that. I don't really have an opinion one way or another about whether that's the most important thing to send to the actuaries, but I'm just wondering about process. Is it something that we agreed to send? And if so, can we have a group decision-making process if we're going to make changes to an agreement? I don't honestly remember.
I don't think it was something that we agreed to as a full group. It was a request that was made that we have said right along needed to be made when we know whether we have enough in our budget to do that.
Okay, I honestly don't remember.
I wasn't part of that meeting amongst you guys.
My understanding was that what we talked about was that that would be the final, it couldn't be done anyway until 34 or whatever that was called was. And that we are going to, when Chris goes through the actuarial reports that we got, we are going to have to do some tweaking and ask for more report. So if that's going to cost us $40,000 to do that, we won't have the money left to do the fifth study. I mean, it is as simple as that, I believe. And
I just want to check the Act 75, because I thought that was language in there around this proposal. So,
it did say, look at the judiciary and corrections, but it didn't specify that we
Are you
should.
comfortable?
What? I think Pat is unmuted. That's okay. But I mean, I think that we should proceed here with our agenda. And then when we do go through the actuarial reports and figure out what it is that we need to have redone, then we can talk more about this, because it doesn't make any, in my mind, it doesn't make any sense to talk about it now, since we have no idea if we're gonna be able to do it or not. So does that make sense? Is the clock right? Is it 9:45?
No,
No,
it's 9:15.
All right, the clocks in the State House, I don't know if you know this or not, but are all different, and they're different. I love it because you can leave the lounge at 5 minutes to 1 and get to the GovOps room at 20 minutes to 1, or you can leave at 5 minutes to 1 and get there at 1:15. So
you just never
it
know.
you just never know. And but I just wondered if that clock was right, so thank you. We do need to look at the timeline for the rest of our meetings. If we we'll spend today looking at the actuarial reports and what we need to tweak and where we need to go. And then we have a meeting scheduled for the 8th, 9th, and then the final one on the 15th, and we're going to have to come up with a report and recommendations on the 15th. That everybody's understanding? Peter?
So one of the things, I know what Act 75 says, it says 15 December. However, this report is going to go to House GovOps, and Madam Chair is the chair of House GovOps. So as long as we get this report in time for GovOps to begin to take action on it fairly early in the session, we're fine.
Yes.
And so what I'm saying is I think we might need a, I don't know how many more meetings we actually have in the bank that we can use. I know we have at least one.
I think we can.
And I don't know about others, but the week after Christmas week is probably a week we're going to have to meet to be able to finalize this report, unless we want to meet on Monday, the first, whatever, the 2nd or 3rd of January, which that would not be my preference.
No, I can't do that.
So I would
just know
recommend
that,
that we schedule a meeting for the last week of December to finalize the report.
I'm fine with that. I think that so when I guess I don't know where everybody else is on that.
It will also give the action, I don't know when the actuaries, if we do send something to them, how long it will take them to turn it around. Will give us a little bit of time just in case they don't turn it around as quickly as we might hope.
Yeah, and whether it starts in the House or the Senate,
it won't be a bill until January 4th. I mean, it won't be introduced until January 4th.
And the important thing here, this is the last thing I'll say for now, is that we do good work, not that we do fast work.
Yes, agreed. Agreed. Anybody else? I mean, that's the week between Christmas and New Year's, and I don't know where everybody is on meeting that week, but that is about the only week that we could do it.
I'm
So,
available every day.
I will be in Chicago for my nephew's bar mitzvah.
okay,
I can't do the 27th.
I think we should see what we come up with during the meeting today.
Yeah.
Before we talk about scheduling. a
yeah,
future
okay.
meeting.
I think that that makes sense. And then we can also look at it under the agenda setting. Agenda item. Okay, so do we want to, we're a little bit early, but do we want to,
I think we have Ben and Pat with us, so let's shift gears.
yeah,
I don't know.
I see Pat, oh, there he is.
Here, yes, hi.
Hi, Ben. Welcome.
Hello.
Thank you. very much.
So we'll let you introduce yourself.
Okay,
And I don't know how you want to do this, but the show is yours, okay?
thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair and committee members. For the record, I'm Pat McDonald, President of the Board of Directors of Campaign for Vermont. With me today is Ben Kinsley, who is also a board member and our resident policy wonk. I just want to take a moment, if I can, to recognize David Coates, former manager, partner of KPMG, who has helped us with this review of the data that we're going to present today and to put the presentation together for you. He's unfortunately, David wasn't able to join us today because he would have been an excellent addition. So I wanted to make a few introductory comments, summarize the finding of the reports that we sent you, and then turn it over to Ben to review in detail the charts that we provided. The report I'm referring to is entitled The Public Sector Reality. Campaign for Vermont released it on November 10th, and I'm hoping that you all have a copy so that you can follow along. Over the past months, I'm sorry, you got it?
Yep.
Over the past months of all of your pension discussions, which I found fascinating, you are doing a very detailed, incredible job on a very complicated issue. We've heard claims about the state's non-competitive wages. And not that that's not a new statement, because when I was Commissioner of Personnel and in Department of Labor, we heard that way back then. But we decided to verify those statements. And we set out expecting, I did particularly, to find the pension benefits were unquestionably an asset to recruiting and retaining our public sector workforce. And we all said it, and no one ever stepped back and challenged that statement. I was former commissioner of the Department of Labor and twice commissioner of Human Resources. And I was particularly surprised at what we found in the data. There were obviously a number of assumptions that were carried through the years that were just plain wrong. I'm assuming at some point in history they were true, which is how it all started, but no one ever questioned it till we started looking at these numbers. Because it's been a long-standing belief that the public employee wages were below the private sector. And over the years, no one challenged that assertion, particularly me. It was clear in many instances that the exempt or appointed positions were below average for similar positions in the private sector. I remember the Business Roundtable did a report when I was Secretary of Transportation, which showed that my salary, because I was in charge of 1,000 employees, was sorely under the private sector salaries that I would have gotten for that job. And I think that that concept that we knew that the exempt employees were below private sector. And I think we all just assumed that it trickled on down throughout the organization. So the Vermont data that we have in the report comes from the Department of Labor, the Agency of Education, and other public sources. And we came up with 6 key findings, which I'd like to read to you. And then Ben, I'm going to turn it over to Ben, and he's going to go over the charts that support each of these statements so that you know what the numbers are and why we can make these statements. So the first key finding is the average public sector employee is in the top 25% of income earners in Vermont, even before you consider health benefits, which is another discussion altogether. The second one was, on average, employees make nearly $12,000 less in the private sector versus the public sector. The average, number 3 is the average private sector employee makes at least $20,000 less per year in retirement than a public sector employee. And this disparity likely grows when health benefits are considered once again. Wages for public sector employees have grown faster over the past 20 years than private sector employees. And over the past 30 years, as far back as we have data, private sector wages have consistently lagged the public sector. The problem is going to get worse before it gets better. And we've heard this before, as nearly 20% of state workers are approaching retirement. And the last finding was the extraordinary benefits offered to public sector retirees may not be necessary to compete for qualified workers. I think that was the thing that we found most stark in when we're looking at this data, that going forward, we may not need to be quite as generous as we thought we did to compete for the private sector. So I'd like to turn it over to Ben, who can go through the slides with you so that you can see the numbers and see why we made the statements we did. Thank you, Madam Chair and members. Ben?
Thanks, Pat. My name is, for the record, my name is Ben Kinsley. I'm on the board of directors for Campaign for Vermont, one of the authors of the report. And I'm going to walk through a couple of the charts, the key charts that are in there, and then happy to answer any questions that folks have. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Hopefully you'll be able to see some of the charts. I don't know how big your screen is on that side, but hopefully you'll be able to see some of these.
Oh, it's very big. Thank you. Eric, did you?
Mr. King, I was just curious, as you're going through the charts, if we have specific questions on a particular chart, do you mind a question in the moment, or would you prefer us to hold those questions until after?
It's probably, if you have a question in the moment, I'll try to pause in between and allow for questions as we go, because I do think it's often easier to ask those as you're looking at it. So I'll try to pause to give opportunity for that.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Of course. So the first thing that we looked at, it was looking nationally at what these numbers look like. The Bureau of Labor Statistics has pretty good data on what private sector wages versus benefits look like, and they can break that down on an hourly basis to kind of account for part-time versus full-time employees. And even here, we start seeing that there's a pretty big jump between where state and local. And one thing I would point out here is these numbers include local, which are lower. We can see that in our state level data from the Department of Labor, that local government salaries tend to be lower than state salaries, and then state salaries tend to be a little bit lower than federal salaries. So there is a little bit of if we pull the locals out of this data, it would probably be a little higher than it is. It's just that the Bureau of Labor Statistics doesn't do that for how they report this. So the first thing that we see here is that wages are definitely higher. You can see that in that third set of columns there. It's about $8, $7.50 or so more per hour in wages alone that state and local governments are paying. And then the other really big difference is going to be in the retirement, healthcare, and insurance benefits. Those are 2 to 3 times what the private sector is offering. Again, this is national level data. So kind of the next piece to this, we're like, okay, so this is what's going on nationally. This is what the norm is. And then we started digging into some of the state level data. One of the first things that we found was that for teachers specifically, the Vermont's pretty close to the national average, almost right on the national average. We're also higher than some neighboring states like New Hampshire. Our teacher salaries are a little bit higher. And again, this data is actually from it was reported by Ed Week, but it's actually NEA data is where they pulled it from. And one of the other side notes here that we discovered as we were kind of looking into this, like how competitive are teacher salaries nationally. We also found that our student teacher ratio is one of the lowest in the country. It's not necessarily a new finding, but a lot of the states that pay higher, for example, California, is more like a 25-to-1 ratio, whereas Vermont's basically a 10 or an 11-to-1 ratio. So there's a lot of those states that are paying higher salaries are also have a lot more students in each classroom. So pause there in case there are any questions at this point.
Kate?
Hi, my name's Kate, and I'm wondering, does teacher data for other states include just certified teachers?
So I believe it is looking at just certified teachers. I'd have to go back and look at the data reporting standards for exactly how that's being calculated. Those numbers come from the National Education Data Archive, which is a federal government program. So they're consistent reporting standards across all states. I believe it does only include qualified teachers, though.
And do you know if school nursing staff are included?
Off the top of my head, I don't. I'd have to go back and look at the data standards for what they're reporting.
On the chart there, it lists that Vermont is the 16th highest out of 21 states. There's only 21 on there. Has the chart been truncated?
Yeah, the chart is truncated. So we included the top, some of the top states, and then some, for example, like that are similar to Vermont, like Hawaii, Wyoming, New Hampshire. So like California, Massachusetts are the top ones. DC is right behind them. And then trying to show like what the range is a little bit, because when you put all like 50 states on a chart like that, it starts getting hard to tell exactly what's going on. So it is truncated to show some of the highest paying states, and then some ones that are sort of in the same ballpark as Vermont, and then Mississippi is the lowest. So we put that on the chart as well.
And I have a follow-up question. Has the chart been adjusted to reflect the cost of living in each state?
No, it is not. Is not inflation adjusted or CPI adjusted. So again, this is 2019 data from the National Education Association.
I think Peter has a question.
Just a quick comment, thank you. So if you're looking at this electronically, at the bottom of this chart, you can click on the live link, and it brings you to a little bit down, it brings you to a estimated salary for all 50 states for 2018, 2019. So it's got all of it. Thank you.
Yeah. If you're looking at the digital version, the link does go to the full chart and the source. Yep.
Eric, you had a question?
Yeah, it dovetails very well with that. So I did click through to that supporting link. And feel free to follow up with us after if you can't answer it now, but it's a little unclear to me I see the data, but it's the sourcing of the data is a little unclear to me. It's referenced as NEA, but if you could follow up more specifically with the source data, I think it would be helpful.
Yeah. We'll see if we can track that down. that down for you.
John has an
Thank
answer
you.
to that.
Oh, John has an answer?
Yes.
Oh.
If you
okay.
actually look at the document that Peter referenced, there is a link in it to the NEA research that was done.
Okay, now Molly has a question.
Hi, my name is Molly Stoner. I just wanted to point out, I know you were referencing one of your comments was about Vermont relative to New England states. And I just, for the record, want to point out New York, which is our, western border and one of the competitors for teachers. And I want to point out the discrepancy in average salary between New York state teachers and Vermont teachers. Thanks.
Absolutely. Yeah. And something, there's a lot of other things we'd like to look at that we kind of came across in the report. And one of them is to look at, New York is tricky because you have, the city and the surrounding area kind of pulling up the average across the state. And that happens in Vermont too. You have, teachers in the Northeast Kingdom that are making 48,000 a year compared to South Burlington that are making almost 80,000 a year. We have some of that going on here too. So, to compare Vermont to like New York City is probably not the best comparison. We really kind of need to compare it to upstate New York. And that was kind of outside the scope of what we were trying to do in this particular report. But I think that is worth looking at is, what is, how competitive are, teaching positions in Plattsburgh, for example, compared to Burlington and that sort of thing.
Okay, you have another,
Just a quick follow-up. Anecdotally, not anything other than anecdotally, but I do know that 12 years ago, I was vacationing with someone who happened to be a upstate New York teacher. And at the time, their top end salary in the Adirondacks was 25,000 higher than the top salary in the district where I work in Vermont, just as an anecdotal point of reference.
Yeah, that's good to know. Yeah, I think that would be worth looking at to kind of know what that is. Because again, we're not necessarily competing with New York City for workforce. We're probably more likely competing with upstate New York. So I think that is something worth looking at.
thank you. I think we're questioned out on that one.
All right.
Oh, wait.
So-
I guess not.
Sorry, I'm just exploring some of the links that are in the document there.
Sure.
I think it's from the Ed Week article where it talks specifically about regional cost of living differences and that there's a study in there that shows that the rankings change significantly when cost of living is taken into account. Just doing a quick look here, when you consider that, it looks like Vermont moves to 36 out of possibly 51 that are listed here. I believe it has District of Columbia.
Yeah, and so I mean, you can do that cost of, for our purposes of comparing, comparing public sector to private sector, the cost of living in Vermont presumably is going to be the same regardless of what type of employer you have. So that is significant when you're looking at how you compete with other states, but that's not exactly what we were looking at here. We were looking at how is our public and private sector competitive with each other, and in that case, cost of living is sort of irrelevant for that question. Not that it's not an important question to ask, but for the purposes of comparing our public and private employers in the state and how competitive we are with each other, cost of living is sort of the same for both groups.
That may be, your broader point, but in fact, the data on this chart does compare other states. So to not account for that critical information, I think that's questionable at best.
Sure.
What?
I mean, again, the cost of living piece of it was sort of, we weren't trying to say how competitive, Vermont is with other states. I think that is worth looking at. It's really, how competitive are wages, and then how do the overall picture of wages and benefits compare between the public and private sector here in Vermont. All right, so this is probably the chart that kind of lays it out the cleanest. So what's going on here is we took we added both the median and the 75th percentile metrics from the Department of Labor to as reference points to kind of understand like what the range is here. Because one of the things is when you start looking at salary ranges, particularly in the private sector, there's a very large range compared to what's happening with private sector employees. It's just a narrower salary band. Pat got to that a little bit with, some of the research that came out in the late 2000s around, executive positions in state government being undercompensated compared to the private sector. That's almost certainly true because they're still the top income earners, but they're making less than, an equivalent position in the private sector. But the floor is also higher. So like the entry level salaries for the public sector is higher than the entry level salary in the private sector. So, it's just a narrower salary band when you start looking at that. That's why the medians and the 75th percentile are in there to kind of help us understand where those fall. Private sector salaries, 48,400 is the average. We threw all workers in there, which includes private and public, just to kind of, again, give another data point for comparison purposes. The average state employee is, and this is again 2019 data, 60,565, and then average teacher salaries are right there as well at 60,200. And both of those numbers, interesting, when you start looking at 75th percentile, both of those numbers are very close to being in the top 25% of income earners. So that was one of our most interesting takeaways off the bat when we started looking at the DOL data, was that on average, teachers and state employees are both making more than 75% of other workers on average, which is interesting. So I think that, and also $12,000 more per year on average in the private sector. Now there are some differences there with what we'll get into here in a second, but any questions on this chart before we kind of dive into that?
Sorry, me again, this is Molly. I just wondered if you had a juxtaposition we could look at with this chart that has to do with education required for different positions.
Yep. Yeah. So we do have a slide that looks specifically at teachers because we recognize that there was going to be a difference in the education levels required for teachers as opposed to other types of workers. When we start looking at state employees, it gets difficult because there's often not comparable positions, comparable positions between state government and the private sector. So that starts getting difficult to compare. That is a piece of this that we'd like to dive into further as we work. There's probably going to be a phase 2 to this project. And that's something we would like to look at a little bit in a little more detail, but looking at the Department of Labor data, it's really kind of difficult to compare, equivalent positions in the state government to the private sector.
Just to follow up, I'm sorry, I thought I heard you say, yes, you had done that with teachers. Can you direct me to that part of the data?
It's, I think it's going to be slide 6 or 7. Let me see here. Yeah, slide 6. Yep.
And I have figure names. Do you know the figure name? Oh, there it is. Okay.
Yeah, it's going to, yeah. So we'll get to that here in a second. Yeah, so again, this is looking at 2019 data. So we, looking at this, we're like, okay, well, we were, Pat and I both thought, and the other folks that were involved in helping putting this data together, it's like, that's not really what our understanding was, that, that state employees and teachers are actually making more on average than the private sector. So we decided to go back as far back as we could, looking at the DOL data. DOL data goes all the way back to 1990. So we didn't put all all 30 years in the chart here because it starts to dilute some of what is happening over the past decade or so. But I think that all that data is in the full report. What we found was that at no point in the last 30 years, as far back as we have data, have private sector salaries exceeded the public sector salaries on average. There are going to be individual positions, like we talked about, like executive level positions that are going to be underpaid in the in the public sector. Even things like IT, for example, may be underpaid in the public sector versus the private sector. So there are some like specific job categories that may be less competitive, but looking at the overall picture, the overall picture is that our state jobs pay pretty well in terms of wages. Because again, this is just wages. Both of those charts are just wages. We're not looking at benefits in either of them. A couple things that we do notice here is that over the past 20 years, state employee wages have grown 5% faster than the underlying economy and have even outpaced industries like healthcare by 10%, which is interesting. So there is, there are even with some somewhat similar industries, pretty competitive wage growth, and the wage growth is outpacing the public sector. One thing to note here that is interesting and is probably worth sort of outside the scope maybe of what this task force is looking at, but what would be interesting to understand is that since 2010, teacher salaries have started to come down a little bit or grow less fast. I shouldn't say they come down. They've started the rate of growth has decreased for teacher salaries. That's likely because of shrinking student populations are causing budgetary constraints. So budgets aren't growing as fast. That would be my assumption, but it's just kind of an interesting thing to note. We actually saw in 2019 is the first time in the data that's available where state employees actually caught up to teachers for average salary. So interesting data point. I'm not sure how relevant that is for the work that you guys are doing, but something that's probably worth looking into more at some point.
Mr. Kingsley, I'm glad you highlighted the difficulty of comparing across job groups. If you go into source one and you look at the job codes, there's an incredible amount of disparity between the number of jobs included in the private sector versus state government, federal government, and local government. I'd be curious as to how you defend statistically rolling all of those disparate job positions into one and averaging them out as a meaningful comparison.
Yeah, I think it's a meaningful comparison because a worker who is qualified and they're looking at a job posting for a state job versus a private sector job, chances are even with the wages alone, chances are that the state job is going to pay higher wages on top of whatever benefits are being offered.
So I'd highlight for you code number 92, which is public administration, which includes public safety employees. How do you make a meaningful comparison to a job group like that to an average of private sector employment that is so meaningfully different in how you carry out the job and the risks associated with that position?
Yeah, I think that, we can get into details like that. I'm happy to answer individual questions like that. I think that it's, like I said in the beginning, it's very difficult to compare individual job roles from the private sector to public sector, which is why we're looking at averages and medians, because that gets at what is the collective experience of this group of employees versus the collective experience of this group of employees. So that's the comparison we're trying to make. And individual job titles and individual job roles are difficult to compare even within the private sector. A job title in one company does not necessarily translate to the same exact job in another company. So even within the private sector, it's difficult to compare, let alone trying to compare private sector job roles and titles to a public sector one on an individual level. So those types of comparisons are tricky and difficult to do, which is why we're looking at averages and medians.
I'm just making an analogy right now in my head that doesn't work for me, what you just said. I'm thinking about another task the legislature is taking on right now, which is student weighting studies. And we're looking exactly at how you have to pull apart those averages to understand what's actually going on in a situation. So for example, you could say students in, Burlington have much higher amounts of money needed to support each student. And you could compare that to somewhere else in the state where it's very different. But when you pull those numbers apart and look at the details, you see that there are many more students who are English language learners in the Burlington area, and therefore the needs are required. And so I don't actually agree with you that the averages give us the better data. Just stating that for the record.
Yeah, so I think that you could do an in-depth analysis of this. That's to look individually at job levels. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. I'm saying it's difficult to do. And if you don't do it well, it doesn't give you meaningful data. And so that was beyond what we were able to do in this report. To be able to dig into individual job roles and compare them was a larger scope than we could take on in this particular report. That is something that the state probably should look into. This is something that I would encourage, the state to look at, how competitive are individual job roles within state government compared to the private sector. But what we're trying to do is kind of give you an overall picture of what is the collective experience of our private sector employees versus the overall collective experience of our public sector ones.
Well, sorry, this is a lot. I think one of the issues with what you just said is giving an overall experience. What we're saying you can't give an overall experience of public sector versus private sector when you don't break down education experience, et cetera. This is sort of like, because it even says in your report, the verdict. We're saying that the Vermont annual earnings from 2019 are stating this for Vermont state employees versus the private sector. It is literally comparing the apples to oranges. I hate using that analogy, by the way, but I'm going to use it. Because this is giving, the title of your report, the public sector myth. That's basically saying we already have all the facts. You don't have all the facts. You haven't parsed out all the data on the different types of jobs in private sector and public sector. So I feel like this part of your report, if that's what you want to call it, is very, very, very deceiving. And I just want to put that out there. You don't break down the different jobs. What I do in the education I had to obtain is completely different from whichever average of the private sector you are comparing my job to. And that's for everyone who works a public sector job. No, and by the way, I'm not putting down anyone who works at a fast food restaurant, but that's a different education level and experience level than a public employee who has to go through a rigorous hiring process and has to have a level of experience before they can have that job. So I'm just putting that out there, that is a highly valuable part of this report.
Yeah, there's going to be individual comparisons that, don't make sense, and comparing a state employee to to someone working at McDonald's, doesn't necessarily make sense because for a number of reasons. But not all private sector employees work at McDonald's. So, and also not all, public sector employees are executives. So, again, there's a range of experiences within that, within that average. All right, so there was a question earlier on comparing individual job roles. And we did do that with teachers because teachers in particular have a higher education level. So two things that we did here is we looked at three things really. We looked at what the hourly wages and benefits for teachers are. We compared that to, and teachers specifically that worked for public employers. The Bureau of Labor Statistics doesn't break this out for private teachers, private school teachers. So, but they do report all teachers, which includes both the public and private employers. So we included those numbers here to show that, the ones in red are the ones that are just public school teachers employed by public school, and then green is all teachers. We can see that when you include the private school teachers in those numbers, it draws the average down, which would indicate that private school teachers are paid less than our public schools. How much less, we don't really know. We just know that when we include them in the numbers, it pulls the average down. And that's true for both wages and salaries. Because we stacked those in the bar chart here to illustrate where some of those differences are. It's not a huge difference, but again, we also have we have a lot more public school teachers than we do private school teachers. So, so there's some information that can be gained from that. We also compared teachers to nurses because, nurses have a similar level of education requirements, ongoing certifications and things like that, similar to what teachers have. And you can see even with nurses, teachers are still making about $7 more an hour. Although the benefits are fairly decent for nurses. Healthcare tends to pay better benefits than most of the private sector. So those are somewhat comparable with what teachers are seeing. So any questions on this particular chart?
Could I jump back to the previous? Keith, could I just jump back to the previous?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Ben, before we left, the idea that averaging and medians are a meaningful comparison, I wanted to highlight that accommodation and food services and retail trade are the second and third largest sources of private sector employment. They also happen to be lower wage fields of employment, and there is no government equivalent. So I have to challenge the notion that drawing anything from the average or median is really meaningful in any way.
Okay, thank you.
That's
Kate,
yeah.
all right, did you want to respond? And then Kate has a question.
Sure. Yeah, so food service certainly is, but I mean, you look at things like construction and road road maintenance and things like that, which are fairly low wage jobs in the public sector. And there may not be a perfect comparison to to the public sector in those types of roles. Things like plowing, for example. Maybe there's not really a perfect comparison from the private sector to the public sector. So, that can sort of go both ways, but, to your point, yeah, food service, there's some limited employment for food service in state government, but mostly it's contracted out.
I mean, if you look at NISCS code 72 and 44 to 45, there is no comparison. It's not whether there's a perfect comparison or not. There just simply is nothing to compare to.
Yeah,
those are two of the largest sources of data that you're utilizing in your analysis.
Yeah, and we looked at a number of those that are compared, that are, there's maybe a dozen or so of those NCS codes that are comparable, or there are comparable, direct comparisons between public and private sector. and most of them are right in line with each other. So we did look at that. And the ones that are directly comparable, there wasn't a huge difference that we found between the comparable ones and that were in the data set. So I think that bears further investigation. And that's something we would like to look at in probably a phase 2 of this report.
Kate, did you have a question?
Yeah, your report compares 2 female-dominated professions, nursing and teachers, and there have been years of studies on the issue of gender inequality. Isn't it true that these reports conclusively found that females suffer from a gender pay gap such that men with similar degrees make more than women?
That's certainly true nationally. Something we did look at in some of the data that's available from DOL is the wage gap between men and women, and they do break it down in some industry level, not at the job role level that we see on this particular chart. But Vermont has actually done some great work in this area where our pay gap is significantly less than the national average. We're pretty competitive when it comes to that. That is a factor certainly, but it's probably less of a factor in Vermont than it is in other states.
Isn't it true that by cherry picking 2 female-dominated professions, you're highlighting the pay inequity between men and women and hiding the fact that men make more than women merely because of gender?
I think we were trying to do is compare 2 professional occupations that have similar education requirements.
Most teachers are far more educated than nurses. And so I'm wondering, shouldn't you have compared them to other highly educated male-dominated professions like engineers, lawyers, or doctors? The information that I have in front of me says that about 95% of secondary teachers, which I am a secondary teacher, have a bachelor's degree or more. And then as far as registered nurses, we're looking at maybe 65% compared to 95%.
So if we're specifically looking at new hires, pretty much all hospitals require bachelor degrees now. The ones that don't, the nurses that don't have a bachelor's degree likely have been practicing for a number of years. But they're really, hospitals are not hiring people at this point that don't have a bachelor's degree.
Okay, even still, we've in secondary school teaching, that's where I am, we have 56% have a master's degree or higher. And as far as the registered nurses data that I have, we're looking at about 12%.
Yeah, if you can send me those numbers, that'd be great. I'd be happy to look at those. I don't think comparing teachers to doctors is necessarily a good comparison. Doctors usually have 8 years of education. Not that teachers don't. Some post-secondary teachers certainly do, but that's not a perfect comparison either.
So I'm going to remind us that we have about 15 minutes left to get through this report.
Sure.
So just a reminder that because we have all of our actuarial work to do after this, and that's pretty heavy plowing. So.
Perfect. Well, we'll wrap this up here. So I think, some of the high points that Pat touched on in the beginning, when you're again looking at averages, private sector is about $12,000 less per year than the public sector. The public sector is top 25% of income earners. They're in the top quarter. And they've also seen more sustained high wage growth over the past 2 decades. They've grown faster than the underlying economy and faster than private employment wages. And where we come out of this, I think we don't have necessarily specific recommendations about how you solve this, how you address this from a pension perspective. I think the main takeaway for us is that, you know, where it comes down to, you know, benefits and how benefits factor into the competitiveness of our private sector or public sector workforce. You know, we're already seem to be pretty competitive on wages, and what that may mean for the pension discussion is that those benefits that we offer that are 2 or 3 times what the private sector offers may not be as necessary as we thought it was. I think that's the main takeaway here, because wages are actually more competitive than we might have thought previously. So that's, I think, the big takeaway we have. A couple of points that I want to reiterate, even you know, to what our recommendations around pensions have been, is we need to keep our promises to existing state employees. You know, we made those promises. We need to keep them. And also, you know, their concern is that this is going to get worse before it gets better. Pat mentioned that we have 20% of our state workforce that is eligible to retire now or within 5 years. That's a large, that is a large percentage. We've already seen this sort of happening with teachers over the past 12 to 18 months. We've had a lot of retirements for teachers, and we're likely to see a lot of retirements in our state employees as well. So this is going to drive, you know, drive some of those pension costs that we've been talking, you know, that everyone's been talking about. That's concerning. So we've got to figure this out. And I really appreciate all the work that this task force is doing. It's important work. And we need to get these pension plans and our healthcare plans back on sustainable footing, so that we don't risk the future retirement promises that we've made to these state employees. So I think that's the overall takeaway. And you know, we would encourage the committee to look at you know, what benefits are necessary for new hires specifically, to see what we can do there. Because you know, what I think this data is suggesting is that wages are already pretty competitive. And so we don't necessarily need to be as afraid of touching benefits for new hires as we might have been previously. So any questions on that?
Yes. So to address the nature that Leona had brought up of this kind of apples and oranges comparison, are you familiar with an article that Phil Kessling wrote entitled "What a Public Employee Really Costs"?
No, I'm not familiar with that article.
Okay, well, Mr. Kelsing points out that the study, and this is in reference to the BLS study that that your report relies on. The study simply calculates the average cost of wages and benefits for all private sector workers, then compares them to all state and local government workers. It's a bit like comparing the Green Bay Packers to the San Antonio Spurs and exclaiming Spurs on average are 45% taller. They're different games in different worlds. After all, government has virtually no minimum wage fast food workers, and the private sector is pretty light on firefighters and K through 12 teachers. I'd also like to highlight a report that the National Institute of Retirement Security authored entitled "Out of Balance: Comparing Public and Private Sector Compensation Over 20 Years." I would like that to be the committee to enter that into the record as well, to be provide both aspects of the view here. I have a question getting to compensation maybe not needing to be where it is. There's quite a lot of vacancies in state government at the moment. If compensation was as rich as you suggest, why do you think that exists?
So there's an analogy to this that I just saw recently. That's interesting. You know, so yes, there's a lot of vacancies in state government. there's a lot of vacancies in the private sector as well. Many businesses are struggling to find employees across all different salary bands. And one example of this I just saw, there was an article this week, I think it was in Digger, on superintendents that were having a hard time hiring teachers. And the analogy was that they used to have 200 or 300 applications for a teacher opening in Burlington. And this year they've only gotten, whenever they have a teacher opening, they've gotten like 50 applications. And talking with private businesses, they would love to get 50 applications. Often they get 0 or a half dozen applications for an open position. So this is an experience that all employers are facing right now. I think that the state is still more competitive than most private sector businesses when it comes to hiring.
Just thinking about the analogy and the point in Burlington, which is one of the higher paid districts in the state, and considering that significant drop in applicants there, I work in Waterbury, and 10 years ago when I applied for my kindergarten teaching job, we had over 200 applicants for 2 positions. This past spring, we had 2 open positions. We had 5 applicants.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. And I'm hearing a lot of that same, private sector has never gotten 200 applicants unless it's a really highly competitive business. But I'm hearing a lot of the same things from private sector businesses about, getting a half dozen people that apply, even to jobs that a few years ago would have gotten 10 times that. So.
Right, but we're talking about public sector and teachers, not private sector. We're trying to focus that conversation.
Yeah, Molly, I think.
I was just going to echo Andrew. I noticed that none of your data about teacher salaries and things was from south of 89. I work down in the southeast corner of the state. We've had 0 applicants for some open positions. And, it's been really challenging. 50 is by no means any kind of average right now.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. That's, Burlington would be considered highly competitive in that space. So my point is though, that the workforce problems are broader than just our public employees. They're being felt in both the private and the public sector, was my point there.
Any other comments or observations? Whoops.
Sorry,
That's okay.
I was gonna pass my dollar.
In my committee, you would be required to take us all to Sarducci's for dinner.
Sarducci's.
Yes, and our spouses or dates or whoever. Mhm.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so, yeah. Yeah.
Mr. Kingsley, if I understand correctly, you're relying on the average and the median to draw these comparisons. Do you adjust for education, training, and experience in any way?
We looked at that for teachers, yeah. And we did look at it for a little bit for state employees as well. And again, those comparisons are really difficult to make because often there is no equivalent position between the public and private sector.
Any other comments or wrap up? So thank you very much for doing this and coming and presenting it to us. Do you have any final words for us? Or thoughts or observations?
I think the only thing what I would leave you with is that we really appreciate the work that you're doing. This is not easy. These are not easy conversations to have. I think our recommendation, given this data, is to look at the benefit plans for new hires as much as possible. and trying to keep the promises we made to existing employees. I think that's our main recommendation, given this data. Pat, do you have anything else to add to that?
No, I agree with you totally, Ben. You really summarized it really well. The committee's primary focus is to safeguard the long-term stability of our pension funds. We're hoping that this information will help you make those decisions on the pension side. Salaries are another discussion altogether as far as individually, but collectively, we have to look at the pension funds and keep our promises. So thank you very much for this opportunity, and we'll be back to you with phase 2.
Thank you, thank you. I hope we'll be done with our work before phase 2 hits us. But
You will, but I think this is going to be an issue that's going to be discussed for a while.
it is indeed, but I think this task force hopes to be done before phase 2. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. You're welcome to stay.
So
Yes, I'm
we have on our agenda now a 15-minute break.
May I ask
So,
one question before we break?
sure.
I just noticed on the agenda in the afternoon that there's a time for small breakout groups. And I have 2 questions about that. I don't really remember the agenda setting, but when I thought about the breakout groups, I remembered the first time we did it when the public couldn't hear, and we got a lot of feedback about that, which concerns me. And I also remember coming back to this group, and a number of us felt like expressed and felt like, oh, that's a good idea. I wish we had thought of that. And we didn't have time at that point to process. And I'm wondering if the group as a whole might reconsider that idea of small breakout groups and instead stay together for those discussions.
So what we've done is we've found 3 rooms where we can have 3 separate Zooms and streams. So it will be open and accessible to the public. They'll be able to tune in and watch, and may not be a camera on each individual, but the audio from the room should come through just fine. And you'll notice that there is time in the agenda this afternoon for us to share our design scenarios,
Yeah, I did
so that we can come back and share those ideas. If one group sees something that another group did, you can certainly share those. I think, I don't know about you, but I also talk with other members of the task force during lunchtime too. So if there are things that you see in the actuarial analysis that you think you'd like to learn more about, perhaps you can have a lunchtime chat as well.
Yeah, I'm happy to hear about the multiple technological solutions. I'm just wondering how others feel about the small group versus large group. And I appreciate having some time to come back. I remember last time we did share, but it was in that sharing where we were like, ooh, I wish we had had time to chew on that. And it's the chewing on it. I'm often inspired by the thinking of others around the circle. I don't know how others feel about that.
We can hear how others feel about it. I think that because the
results of the first round are so starkly different from the different groups that the conversation will be very different in the different breakout groups.
And there are
Yes.
different concerns.
Right.
So I think that trying to deal with everything in the large group I thought a lot about this, and because I was on your thought wave there for a long time, but I think that when we hear the report from the actuaries, I think that we will see that there probably is a need for some breakout sessions, whether it's that long or not, I don't know, but I think that we'll hear that when Chris walks us through those. And
I'd love to check in with you at the break. Maybe you can help me understand your change of mind.
Yep.
And
Dan,
I just, again, I agree with Molly. I think at this point, it does make sense as a group, maybe to look at each thing individually. Maybe it makes sense to, let's just say, an hour on group F, an hour on teachers, an hour on group proceed. But at the very least, I would request, and I think it only makes sense at this point in time, that whether if it's John and I again, that we join with Eric and Leona, because they do have members that are part of groups. And I think we are getting to a point where it wouldn't be, in my opinion, just for just one of, just the troopers association to be making decisions for VSEA members. So at the very least, I would make that request that we at least join them or have some time to sit down with them and go through all of that together.
And I think that happened last time too, because I think that you finished up rather quickly and then joined.
We did, but we didn't have, in my opinion, we didn't really have a good chance to
Yeah.
sit down with Eric and
But now-
Leona to say, okay,
Yeah.
what are you guys thinking about this?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yep, good. I think that's a good suggestion.